to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we start a 6-week series with you that we think is very important and a very serious topic. Our discussions for the next 6 weeks will evolve around Beyond Darkness, a Human Response. In order to accomplish this goal of a 6-week series, we want to give special recognition to the North Idaho College Convocations Committee series, and we are very grateful that they're providing us these speakers while they're on campus over this period of time. We want to particularly thank Jean Ann Mitchell, who chairs that committee and has been most supportive of our having those guests with us on this program. For week number 1, we want to talk about the subject competition, why we all lose in our race to win, according to today's guest. Our guest is Alfie Kohn, who is a scholar, a teacher, and a journalist, and is the leading critic of America's what he calls obsession with competition. His writings on this subject include a book that we would recommend for your reading. It's entitled No Contest, The Case Against Competition, which came out in 1986 and would be available through local bookstores. In addition to this, it's my understanding that our author is in the process of writing a second book entitled Beyond Selfishness, The Brighter Side of Human Nature. In addition to those 2 publications, he has either written articles or has been written about him, his work, in many journals across this country, including Psychology Today, The Atlantic, Working Mother, The Rotarian, New Age Journal, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, Newsday, The Boston Globe, The Chicago Tribune, and on the list goes. He has also been on national programs such as The Donahue Show. It's a very special honor for us to have you on our program, and Mr. Kohn, we welcome you.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be here.
And as always, I'm very happy to have regular panelist Janelle Burke, an Idaho attorney, and I shall ask Janelle to commence the questioning.
Mr. Kohn, it is nice to have you here with us today. Can you tell us how you became interested in competition and the effect that it has on us and on our society?
I didn't have any sort of once-in-a-lifetime experience. I think often people who read my book have the sense that I was spiking a volleyball one day and suddenly realized, wait, there's a problem here. It was nothing quite so dramatic as that. When I was in graduate school, about 10 years ago, I realized that it was an interesting topic, considered writing a dissertation on it myself, decided not to, wrote one article, and several years later found myself circling back to the topic when I went to the library to see what resources existed that looked at competition's effect in the workplace, in the playing field, in the classroom, the family, drawing from many different academic fields. Nothing existed, and I decided to fill the void long before I knew whether it was a publishable venture.
And do you do your own research then with respect to that, or do you draw on other people's research?
I draw on other people's research and my own thinking and experience. I don't have a laboratory. I work on my own. But I went through about 400 studies beginning in 1982 that resulted in this book, No Contest, which takes a rather unorthodox point of view, which is where the research led me.
And what is your theory?
Well, what I've concluded is that competition is, contrary to everything we've been brought up to believe, psychologically destructive for us, poisonous to our personal relationships, and counterproductive in the workplace and the classroom. Contrary to these myths that most people in America are led to believe, competition is not an inevitable part of human nature. It is not necessary for excellence and productivity. It does not build character, and it's not even necessary for games and having a good time. Competition means simply, I can succeed only if you fail. If we strip away all the myths and beliefs about it, that's what it boils down to. And it turns out that setting people against one another is not a particularly effective or productive way to get a job done or to allow people to grow up healthy. It's ruinous to us as individuals and ultimately injurious to our whole society.
You were educated at Brown University and also the University of Chicago, and so I would build on what Janelle is asking by indicating that when you were in those particular institutions, which are prestigious institutions, and there's a lot of competition for grades, and of course in graduate school that's the case, did you have any of these concepts or theories at that time, or were you part of that process and this came at a later time?
My thinking on this evolved. I did not have a fully formed notion that competition is destructive, and especially didn't have the idea that it was unproductive in the workplace and the classroom until I looked at the research. Before that, I assumed, like most people do, that without competition we all become fat and lazy and mediocre, and it's the only way to motivate people. I assumed there had to be a trade-off of some kind, a little less competition so we could be happier and healthier, even if it meant sacrificing some performance. It turns out that there's no trade-off, that competition is as bad in one respect as it is in another. But these ideas were, I suppose, percolating even while I was studying, and I was certainly exposed to competition. I didn't grow up in a library. I'm aware of the real-world effects and exigencies and restrictions, and I've won and I've lost and I've not competed and have had an experience similar to most people, I suppose.
Something that you deal with in your work and in your lectures, and that is what you believe are the myths that have been placed upon society that keeps this process in place of competition. And I know one thing that you've given a lot of emphasis to is that you react rather strongly, I suppose, to when someone says, well, this is part of human nature, and without the competition, society would not survive. Would you take us through your ideas of why you think that's a myth to say that it's part of human nature, and also in some of the other myths that you think that are placed upon society?
The human nature myth could occupy us for the remaining half hour by itself. When people are confronted with a challenge to ideas about the way our society runs, the easiest thing to do is not to say, I think your challenge is misinformed, I don't like your values, and here's why. It's much easier to just say, that's a charming idea, but unfortunately, and it's usually accompanied by a shrug like so, usually a patronizing smile too, unfortunately it's just human nature to be competitive, aggressive, territorial, stubborn, lazy. Notice they're always bad things. No one ever says, well, of course she helped him. It's only human nature to be generous. No, we reserve that for the nasty side of human nature, and without reason, I might add. It's a profoundly conservative argument masquerading as realism, a way of postponing change. But in fact, there's no research to support it. I expected that there would be considerable data lying behind the idea that we hear so often in casual conversation and in magazine articles, that we compete because it's life. It's the way human nature is. There is, however, considerable evidence to suggest it's not true. First, when children, even in this culture, are exposed to cooperative models, working together, working with each other instead of against each other, they absorb that lesson and they like it and they use it. And second, many cultures are totally non-competitive in their educational system, their economic system, and the way they play. So in short, it seems fairly clear to me that we compete because we were raised that way, not because we're born that way. And to say that doesn't mean that we can become a non-competitive society by next Wednesday. We have been taught and socialized very carefully. In fact, it's interesting to ask why we have been socialized so carefully if it's really part of human nature. If that was true, there'd be no need to teach children as carefully as we do from the earliest years that you've got to beat other people in order to be a good person.
Along that line, would you like to share any of the other myths that you think that society has?
The second myth I mentioned is the idea that competition is necessary for excellence or performance or productivity. The myth that I mentioned a few moments ago, I myself shared until I saw the data. It turns out that competition holds us back from doing our best work. That study after study in the workplace as well as in the classroom suggests that people are working at their best, doing their most creative problem solving, and this is true of children and adults, when they're able to work together, to share their talents and skills and resources, when they don't have to worry about someone trying to step on their face or their back in order to get ahead themselves. One study, for example, showed that people in the workplace working together to place people in jobs, employment training counselors, were far more effective when they cooperated than when they tried to win the prize. And the reason, I think, besides what I've already said, is quite clear. On reflection, it wasn't clear to me in the beginning, and that is that when you compete, your mind is focused on the reward of the victory, not on the task at hand, how much you like it and how well you're going to do at it. So doing well, success, and beating others, victory, are two completely different concepts that in practice pull in opposite directions, contrary to everything that we're raised to believe. We're raised to confuse them. How can I do well if I'm not trying to be number one? In fact, it's a confusion of theory and practice.
I'm reading into what you're saying, that because we have given such emphasis to competition and winning, someone winning and someone losing, would I be correct to assume that that might cause more and more people to be directed in doing things that they really don't like, and that without that, people would choose more to do in life what they find enjoyable?
People tend to drop out of activities in a competitive environment if they feel they're not going to be able to beat other people, which leads me naturally into another myth, the idea that it builds character. I like to say that competition is to self-esteem as sugar is to teeth. It corrodes self-esteem. It's bad for our feelings about ourselves. We feel terrible when we lose. We're not really satisfied for very long when we win. And all we learn from competing is that we need to compete more to meet our emotional needs. As a result of that effect, and the other effect that competition ruins our relationships with each other, we are set against each other, after all, as rivals. My success depends on your failure, and vice versa. This has an effect on performance. If I'm feeling doubtful about my own worth, and if I'm not able to trust you, then I'm not going to be able to do a very good job. Rather, a non-competitive environment in which we are urged to work with each other, to depend on each other, is one that is conducive to excellence. I would go so far as to say that, contrary to the myth that competition is what made this country great, that this country has been great in spite of competition, not because of it. To the extent that we have managed to work together despite the official myth, the state religion being the idea of having to become number one. That's what really holds people back. And I'm happy to talk more about some of the studies, if you like, or to move on to another topic as you prefer.
Janelle Burke.
Well, I would like to ask you about some of the various aspects. For example, competition in the family, and then competition in the classroom. But let's start with the family.
Yeah.
Is it dangerous for husbands and wives to be in competition, for children to be in competition between each other?
It is on both counts dangerous, and it is very tragic, I think, that both occur. The family is supposed to be the refuge, the safe place from a mean, cruel, dog-eat-dog world. And yet we find in the home the same problems all over again, the same competitive pressures, with parents competing to see who will be the child's favorite, and with parents subtly and sometimes unconsciously provoking children to compete, causing the sibling rivalry that then, of course, will be blamed as part of human nature. Parents do this all the time. I mean, it gets the dishes dried, you know? It's a way of getting certain things done in the household. But it sets up an extraordinarily bad and destructive tendency for the child to think of him or herself as good only insofar as he or she beats other people. It sets a terrible message to the child. The self-worth becomes conditional, and it's not great for marriages either, to the extent husbands and wives are secretly or not so secretly competing against each other. That must erode the sense of trust and love and sensitivity that are necessary for any relationship. Marriage, like any loving relationship or friendship or even successful work relationship, has to be based on people taking each other's perspective and rooting for each other. If I'm secretly rooting for you to lose, that's going to be a real problem. And the children pick up on this very early.
What about the classroom? What about what happens in the classroom? There's a lot of competition. I know that. There's competition for grades. And even now we're seeing more competition for higher education slots in selective schools and so forth.
Right.
What do you think of this competition?
We don't even have any room in most American elementary schools, for example, or senior high schools, for the idea of working together, which turns out, according to the research, to be most effective. When that happens, when people and children do learn to work together, we have another name for that. We call that cheating. In most schools that have tried cooperative learning, it turns out to be far more effective than competition or individualized learning in most circumstances. When kids work in groups and you set it up so that no one is finished until everyone has learned, kids sink or swim together, spontaneous tutoring occurs, and the children, according to the studies, feel better about themselves. They like each other more, including accepting children who are different than themselves in ability or ethnic background, interestingly enough. They like the subject matter more, and bottom line results, they do better work. The most important relationship in a classroom is not between the student and the teacher, or between the student and the material to be learned. It's between the student and the student. And that's not something just to be cast off for the cafeteria. That's where learning occurs. And we do our children and ultimately our whole society a tremendous disservice to the extent that we turn classrooms into kind of battlefields as we turn the playing fields, because the child's central message in a competitive classroom is not fractions. The child will forget fractions. The child will forget binomial equations and who the 14th president is. What the child learns from a competitive classroom is everybody else is a potential obstacle to my success. And that is a poisonous lesson that's part of the pedagogy in the classrooms all over this country. Now economists and business people are starting to get the message that you need to work together to be effective. That's why the Japanese are so effective. And it's pretty sad that we have to learn that at age 40, when in many classrooms around the world, teachers have got the message already that we've got to allow kids to learn the skills of working with each other from age 5.
Do you think it's possible that we're missing some very, very bright students simply because they are not molding into the competitive kind of person that we expect in the classroom?
We're not just missing bright students, we're killing off the brightness. We are undermining the natural curiosity that children have in the subjects that they're being taught by getting them to think of themselves as working just to be number one, for the petty and contemptible rewards of a gold star or a little smile face stamp or a Phi Beta Kappa key, you know? All of these things undermine the love of the learning that is what really produces results.
I want to deal with an area that I perceive to be difficult. Maybe you have the answer. In a democratic system, as we have in a constitution, which a democracy, among other things, depends upon electing officials to serve us at different levels, and we've gone through a presidential election recently where 15 people, major candidates, started out in the Democrat and Republican Party, and we know from that democratic process that only one can win and 14 can lose, right, in relation to what you're discussing. And they work and obviously compete, sometimes even in unethical ways, to be the victor and also have that power and oftentimes change history. In many cases, for public policy, it's better. Under your concept, and I'm sure you've given this a lot of thought, how would you deal with that part of democracy in selecting top officials such as the president?
The lot of thought that I've given to it has not resulted in a totally satisfactory answer, not satisfactory for me or you or our viewers, I'm sure. But I do think we need to make the distinction between the race to be president, for example, and the qualities necessary to govern. I argued a moment ago that in the classroom and the workplace, doing well and beating others are two completely different ideas. This is nowhere clearer than in the presidential race. I think it was Gene McCarthy, Democratic presidential contender 20 years ago, who said, anyone who really wants to be president is disqualified for that reason alone. I'm paraphrasing here. And I think what he was pointing out is that a competition in the good old American style does not select for the kind of characteristics that we really need in a leader. It selects for someone who's competitive, for someone who needs power, someone who loves the limelight, someone who likes to raise money and be on TV all the time, whatever it is, sheer endurance, which I suppose is one characteristic. If these qualities overlap with the characteristics to govern a country, it's pure accident. And this is true in all kinds of areas. You know, music competitions, there's very little in common with excellence and with victory there as well, for a number of different reasons. Now, I think it is difficult to imagine how to govern a democratic country of 250 million people without competitive elections. I don't have an easy answer there. I do think that we are deluding ourselves if we think that a competitive election is a necessary part of democracy in its abstract sense. In fact, majority rule is a kind of coercion. Henry David Thoreau said that the majority governs because it's stronger, not because it's more right. And all of the people who voted for a losing candidate have their ideas unrepresented, essentially, in a competitive system. There are several political theorists who have written intriguing books about how real democracy means doing away with competition and deciding things by consensus, getting people together in a room so that they can thrash out ideas and come upon a proposal where each feels heard, listened to, and represented in the final product. Now, how we get 250 million people in a room is, of course, the difficult part, and maybe the answer is we need to think in terms of smaller decision-making units than enormous nation-states.
But I'm again playing the devil's advocate, but you really create a problem. If you're on an island with 100 people, you can have consensus in a lot of different ways than you can, as you indicated, in a large nation. But if we chose to take a path and to break down into smaller groups, but someone else in the world did not do so and was a very powerful nation state, then one's domination and back to competition could be very severely, one's independence from that could be very severely hampered by the fact that a greater power was there to overpower you. I guess what I'm trying to ask is that this, I see this as a very knotty problem we brought up. For it to succeed, would it not have to be some worldwide concept rather than just one place in the world trying it in the modern states that we have with nuclear weapons and the great powers that we have?
No, I don't think so. It would certainly be nice if we could set an example, if there could be a real domino effect in the direction of genuine democracy, which is to say non-competitive decision-making. But I don't think that any country has to do that. Sweden didn't have to wait for the rest of the world to take a leading step in providing 9 months of child care leave, free higher education to everyone, and eliminate unemployment. Switzerland didn't have to wait for the rest of the world before declaring itself neutral. The fact that a country is smaller or less competitive does not leave it a sitting duck. I'm not talking about turning children into doormats. With cooperative learning, they turn out to be more effective at standing up for their own interests when they don't have to compete. And the same thing is true for countries. To the extent we need to defend ourselves from enemies, real or imagined, that does not involve necessarily becoming an enemy and taking on its worst characteristics.
I guess what I'm getting at, though, is that there's the analogy here may be liking in one respect. If a country domestically decides to do something, that they can do. But when you're dealing with ideologies in the world that are a great struggle, the fact that the United States is there with defense and so forth, that is protective to other countries who may be even neutral or do not have a military. I'm just wondering how you deal with the problem as long as you have one particular very strong power that has that military might and that aggression.
Yes. Well, this, of course, gets us slightly off the subject of competition per se and talking about aggression, which is fine. If it were the fact that the United States was using its military might primarily to protect democracy and freedom and neutrality, then I would have a problem on my hands in terms of what happens if we start using ideas of cooperation instead of aggression. I think the historical record shows quite to the contrary, that what the United States is really about doing is overturning governments that don't suit its interests. And that could be a program unto itself, of course. But, you know, from the invasion of one country and sponsoring terrorist armies against another, I think what we're talking about is something quite different. The United States' internal competitiveness matches its extremely aggressive external goals, and I'd like to see both change.
I got one more question. I've got to get back to Janelle. It's like if there's a bully on the block, and if he meets up with one person that is very cooperative, can cooperation take place until there's a willingness for cooperation? I guess what I'm trying to say, both in individual relationships and between nation states, there has to be that willingness to have cooperation for it to work, doesn't it?
If you're talking about you and I cooperating, then yes, both you and I must agree to cooperate. If you're talking about the two of you cooperating and waiting for my approval, then no, you don't have to wait, even if I have more guns or more people, to blow the analogy apart here. It's not necessary to get everyone in agreement in order to do this sort of thing. And of course, what we're doing here is bunching together various issues, whether we're talking militarily or economically or in terms of political systems. Look, some of overturning the worst of a competitive society is going to take a very long time. I have no illusions about that. I'm not naive in terms of a political and economic system. But other of the ideas that I'm trying to get across and that I raise in my book, No Contest, can be done immediately. And here I'm talking about instituting cooperative learning in classrooms, instituting teamwork in corporate workplaces, teaching children and ourselves non-competitive approaches to recreation, challenging the family's need to set people against one another. I don't care what the Soviet Union is doing in order to set up a classroom where everyone works together and learns better. I don't think we have to.
Thank you. Janelle Burke.
I have 4 short topics with about a minute apiece. I know that they'll barely cover them, but how about competitive sports?
I'm not on a national crusade for their abolition, but the question I like to ask is it necessary in order to have a good time that we play highly structured games in which one group tries to defeat another? And the answer is no. Not one of the advantages that we're raised to assume are necessary parts of sports actually require competition. You don't need for exercise or testing your ability or teamwork, to try to set up something in which people try to defeat other people. You can meet those needs of having a good time without turning the playing field into a battlefield, without setting up what George Orwell called war minus the shooting. We do that with children from the very earliest years, where they play musical chairs, and there's one happy, gloating winner seated at the end, and everybody else unhappy and excluded from play. That's how you learn to have a good time in America. There are other approaches.
How about the workplace, our employment?
Well, I speak often to business groups and tell them that it is in their best interest to learn how to structure a workplace in which people stop holding each other back by trying to win. I just emphasize the same research. I mentioned one study before. There are many others having to do with the way a workplace is set up that predicts to more effective, I'm talking bottom line here, not some touchy-feely, groovy kind of feel-better stuff. I'm talking that better, creative problem-solving happens when you do away with all the competition in the workplace. And it turns out, according to other studies, that the business people who are most successful are those who enjoy their work, like a good challenge, but are not competitive.
How about urban versus rural?
Well, that's a descriptive phenomenon. I mean, there's room certainly in societies for both. It does turn out to be the case that in most cross-cultural research I'm familiar with, rural areas tend to be more open to the possibility of cooperating than urban areas, and whole rural cultures are much less competitive than urban cultures. There may be a lesson in there for folks from big cities like me.
And what about the differences between countries? That's the fourth of my little series here. What about the differences between countries, cultures?
Well, the United States seems to be among the most hyper-competitive, desperately addicted to competition societies on the face of the earth. I review in the book a number of societies where there is no competition at all, and a great many more that we're familiar with that simply are a lot less competitive than we are. And again, they're successful, they're happy. It's not a question of you give that up and you've given up everything that's great about America. There are a lot of things great about America, but competition isn't one of them.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're out of time. I wish we had another 30 minutes. We just got started, and you've been intellectually stimulating. We thank you for being here. It's a great start to our 6-week series.
Oh, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Alfie Kohn, who has been discussing competition while we all lose in our race to win. As I indicate at the beginning of this program, we have a 6-week series with you entitled Beyond Darkness, A Human Response. Again, we thank the Convocations Committee at North Idaho College for making the 6-week series possible. We want you to be with us again next week, and we will continue this very important topic. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.